Sign your life away, ex-soldier. My father said it into a microphone loud enough to reach the back wall of the Cypress Ballroom, and 500 shareholders turned in their velvet chairs to look at me, the way people look at a car wreck on the shoulder of the highway, quick, embarrassed, unable to stop themselves. I didn't flinch. I had learned a long time ago that flinching is a currency, and I wasn't going to spend a single cent of it on Richard Miller. I was sitting in the last row, 3 feet from the service exit, exactly where his events coordinator had assigned me that morning, and exactly where I wanted to be. My hands were folded on top of a plain manila folder. Under my blazer, clipped to the inside pocket, was a laminated federal credential that nobody in that room had ever seen, because nobody in that room knew I still worked for the United States government. They thought I was finished, discharged, disgraced, a cautionary tale my father liked to tell at dinner parties about what happens when a soldier gets greedy and turns on her own family's company. They were about to find out how wrong they were, and it was going to take exactly 1 recording, 1 signature, and about 4 minutes. But to understand why I was sitting there, almost smiling, at the single worst moment of public humiliation my father had ever engineered for me, you have to go back to that morning, back before the ballroom, before the microphone, back to when this still looked, to everyone but me, like the day Richard Miller finally finished what he'd started 5 years earlier. I'd left the extended stay off Highway 59 before 6 that morning, while it was still dark enough that the freeway lights hadn't clicked off yet. I don't own much these days, the Army teaches you not to, but there are 3 things I don't travel without. A manila folder with copies I keep separate from the originals, a government-issued laptop that never leaves my sight, and my mother's compass. It isn't a real compass. It's brass, about the size of a poker chip, engraved on the back with 3 initials, EVM, Eleanor Voss Miller. She carried it through 2 deployments as a Signal Corps officer before she ever married my father, before Miller Energy and Defense existed, back when Richard Miller was just a junior engineer who used to pick her up from the airfield in a truck that didn't have air conditioning. She gave it to me the week I left for basic training, and she told me something I didn't understand until years after she died. The direction only matters if you're honest about where you're actually standing. I put it in my blazer pocket that morning, next to the credential, and before I started the car, I let myself sit with one memory for exactly as long as it takes to drink a cup of gas station coffee, because I learned that if I didn't schedule the grief on purpose, it found its own time to show up, usually somewhere worse. The memory was 6 Christmases ago, the last one before any of this started. Julian was 26 then, not yet groomed into the stiff, camera-ready version of himself I'd watched nod at the podium for years since. He'd knelt on the kitchen floor of our father's house, letting our mother's old Signal Corps stories wash over him for the 100th time, while he built a blanket fort for our cousin's toddler, laughing in a way our father never laughed. I remember thinking, watching him, that whatever this family became, Julian was the part of it that hadn't hardened yet. I held on to that memory hard during the 5 years that followed, on nights when it would have been easier to let myself believe he was just as complicit as our father. I needed to believe there was still a version of my brother worth protecting, even if I couldn't tell him why. That belief was about to be tested in a few hours, in front of every camera in the room, and I still didn't know which version of Julian was going to show up. I put the coffee down, started the car, and drove to the Wexford Hotel to watch my father try to erase me in front of 500 shareholders and every business reporter in the state of Texas. Here is what almost everyone in that ballroom believed about me, because it's what my father had spent 5 years teaching them to believe. 5 years ago, I was a captain assigned as a liaison engineer between the Army Corps of Engineers and Miller Energy and Defense on a federally funded microgrid resilience program called Gridlock, hardened power infrastructure designed to keep hospitals and bases running through a coordinated grid attack. 6 weeks before the program's final milestone review, someone found classified Gridlock schematics on a personal drive registered to me, along with an email thread, supposedly mine, negotiating a price with a shell company nobody in the program had ever heard of. Army CID opened an investigation. I was read my rights in a conference room I'd walked into as an officer and walked out of as a suspect. There was no public court-martial, because my father made sure of that. He came to me the week it happened, sat across a different conference table, and told me that a quiet medical separation, psychological unsuitability for continued service, his lawyer's phrase, not mine, would protect the family name and keep this out of the papers. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I remember the room where he said it more clearly than I remember most of the last 5 years. It had a water stain shaped like Florida on the drop ceiling tile above his head, and a legal pad in front of him with 3 bullet points already written before I'd sat down, which told me the conversation had never really been a conversation. He didn't ask if I'd done it, not once. That absence is the detail I kept turning over for years afterward, the way your tongue keeps finding a chipped tooth. A father who believed his daughter was innocent asks what happened. A father managing a liability asks, how do we make this go away quietly? And Richard Miller had asked me the second question inside the first 90 seconds. I signed it, not because I was guilty, because 6 days before that meeting, a woman I'd never met called me from a blocked number and asked me one question. Captain Miller, would you be willing to find out who's actually selling gridlock, even if it means letting your own family believe you did it first? Her name was Renata Cho. She is a special agent with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and the classified files on my drive hadn't been planted by some rival contractor or foreign operative. They'd been planted by someone with a badge to my house, my desk, and my father's company, which meant the leak wasn't outside Miller Energy and Defense. It was inside it. And the only way to find out how deep it went was for the real gridlock thief to believe the Army had already caught the wrong person and closed the file. 5 years is a long time to let a lie about yourself run unchallenged. I'd had a lot of practice not flinching by the time I sat down in the back row of that ballroom. So I let them close it on me. For 5 years, I was the family's cautionary tale. I worked 3 different names across 2 different federal task forces. I learned how Miller Energy and Defense actually moved money, which subcontractors existed only as forwarding addresses, and exactly which invoices from a company called Faro Dynamics had never delivered a single verifiable service. Faro Dynamics billed the company $11 million over 4 years for systems consulting on a Nevada facility that, according to county records, had been an empty warehouse the entire time. That $11 million didn't disappear. It moved, in pieces small enough not to trigger a single compliance flag, into accounts controlled by a holding company called Aurelian Systems, a paper entity registered in Cyprus, with a beneficial owner list that dead-ended exactly once you got past the 3rd shell. Aurelian Systems had, over that same 4 years, acquired the licensing rights to 3 separate microgrid hardening patents. All 3 had originated, in earlier and cruder form, from gridlock. Somebody at Miller Energy and Defense had been selling my mother's husband's company's most sensitive defense technology to a buyer that United States sanctions law would not let anywhere near it, and they had used my discharge as the smoke that let them keep doing it for 5 more years. There's a version of this story where the case built itself in dramatic leaps, a single document that broke everything open, a whistleblower who appeared at the right moment. That isn't how it happened. It happened the way real cases happen, in a rented office above a tax preparation storefront in Alexandria at 11 at night, with 3 years of Miller Energy and Defense subcontractor filings spread across 2 folding tables and a space heater that never quite reached the corners of the room. Faro Dynamics took me 4 months to see clearly, and even then, only because I stopped looking at it the way an auditor looks at a company and started looking at it the way an engineer looks at a structure that shouldn't be standing. Faro's invoices were internally consistent, reasonable rates, plausible line items, a Nevada address that existed on paper and on a county tax roll. What wasn't consistent was the work. I pulled the environmental permitting records for that Nevada facility on a hunch spec 2 in the morning because permitting records don't lie the way invoices can. The facility had never drawn the water or power usage a systems consulting operation of that stated size would require. Not once across 4 years. It was physically an empty building being billed as a busy one. I remember calling Agent Cho at midnight, too wired to wait for a decent hour, and saying only, "It's a shell. The whole vendor's a shell." And hearing her exhale slowly on the other end, the sound of someone who has learned not to celebrate the first thread of anything until she's pulled on it long enough to know it doesn't just unravel into nothing. It didn't unravel into nothing. Over the following months, I traced the payments leaving Faro's account in amounts small enough to avoid a compliance flag, landing eventually in accounts tied to a Cyprus-registered holding company called Aurelian Systems. I found the patent licensing filings. I found, one exhausted Sunday, the beneficial ownership document that dead-ended, deliberately one layer short of a name. The kind of dead end that isn't sloppy, it's engineered, built by someone who understood exactly how far an average auditor would be willing to dig before giving up. I wasn't an average auditor. I was someone with a personal reason not to stop. I found the man who'd planted the files 11 months into the investigation. His name doesn't matter for this story, except that he worked in facilities security, and except that the wire transfer that paid him for the favor was traceable, eventually, through 4 accounts, to a signature authorization inside my own family's chain of approval. I didn't let myself write down whose name that was yet. Not because I didn't know, because some answers you have to keep proving to yourself before you're ready to say them out loud. I want to be honest about something, because a story like this one is easy to tell like a triumph from the very first page, and it wasn't. I spent 5 years reading about my own family from a government laptop and extended stay hotels. I watched my brother Julian's engagement announcement in a newspaper archive database instead of a mailbox. I wrote and deleted a message to him at least a dozen times, something that started with, "I need you to know the truth, isn't what you think it is." And I never sent one of them. Because Agent Cho was right about one thing from the very first phone call. The moment Julian knew, my father would know within the hour, and everything I'd built would collapse before it was strong enough to hold real weight. That's the piece nobody in that ballroom understood as they watched me sit quietly in the back row. They thought a broken woman had crawled home for one last public defeat. What they were actually looking at was a federal auditor who had spent half a decade building a case strong enough that it wouldn't matter who screamed the loudest once it opened. The annual shareholder meeting started at 9, and it started the way it always did, with my father at the podium in a navy suit that cost more than most people's cars, talking about resilience, growth, and legacy in a voice that had once made me believe every word of it. 31 years ago, he said, I built this company out of a single contract and a conviction that American infrastructure deserved better engineering than it was getting. Today, Miller Energy and Defense employs 11,000 people across 4 states. Applause. Camera flashes. Julian sat in the front row beside the board, in a suit nearly identical to our father's, nodding at the right beats, the way he'd been trained to since he was 19. My brother had always been good at nodding at the right beats. It used to be the thing I loved about him, how easily he could read a room and make everyone in it feel steadier. Now I watched him do it and understood, in a way I hadn't 5 years ago, that reading a room and being honest in one are not the same skill. This year, my father continued, the board is also finalizing some overdue matters of family governance. He didn't look at me yet. He was too good a showman to spend that card early. As many of you know, my daughter Sarah left military service 5 years ago, under circumstances the family has, out of loyalty, never discussed publicly. That was wave 1, deniable, a sentence any outsider could read as a father's discretion. Nobody in that room flinched, but me. And I didn't flinch either, because I'd known this speech was coming for 11 days, ever since Agent Cho had confirmed the judge had signed the order. He let it sit. Then he nodded to someone off stage, and the 2 projection screens on either side of the podium lit up with a photograph of me in my dress uniform, the same photograph from my personnel file, stamped now with a red banner across the bottom that read, "Terminated. Security concern." 5 years ago, my father said, and his voice found the exact register of practiced, reluctant sorrow. My daughter was investigated by Army Criminal Investigation Command for attempting to sell classified defense technology developed under contract with this company. She was discharged. I have protected her from public exposure for 5 years, out of love, and because I hoped she would use that grace to rebuild her life quietly. A pause, timed like a man who had rehearsed timing in a mirror. Instead, she has spent this year making unfounded allegations to regulators about this company's financial integrity. Allegations that, if unaddressed, put the pensions and retirement accounts of 11,000 employees at risk. Somewhere behind me, I heard a woman whisper, "My God," to the man beside her. In front of me, an elderly shareholder shook his head slowly, the way people shake their heads when they've already decided how a story is going to end. 2 rows from the stage, I found Gerald Foss, the company's general counsel, sitting very still with his hands folded over a leather portfolio he wasn't opening. He wasn't watching my father. He was watching the exit doors, still in the way a man goes still when he's spent months waiting for a knock and has just started to suspect it's finally arrived. I'd interviewed him twice in the past year, both times through an intermediary, both times with him giving me exactly enough to stay technically uninvolved, and nothing more. He'd made his choice about which way to lean the day he let my father dictate the language of my discharge instead of asking a single question about the evidence. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt something closer to recognition, a man discovering in real time that neutrality has an expiration date. I kept my hands folded. Under the table of my composure, my thumb found the edge of the folder and pressed once, the same tick I'd had since flight school, checking that a strap was secure before the aircraft moved. It wasn't nerves, it was readiness. If anyone in that room had known to look for it, that was the only clue I gave them all morning that I wasn't afraid. Julian took the second microphone. This was the part that still costs me something to remember clearly, because unlike my father, Julian wasn't performing. He believed every word. "Sarah," he said, and for 1 second he looked directly at me, and there was real hurt on his face, not theater. "I've defended you to people for years. I told them there had to be an explanation. I kept believing that until 6 weeks ago, when our legal team showed me the correspondence with the regulators myself." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't understand why you'd try to hurt people who still work here, people who had nothing to do with whatever happened between you and Dad." I want to tell you I felt nothing hearing that, because it would make me sound stronger than I was. I didn't. I felt something crack quietly in my chest, that ache of being misunderstood by someone who genuinely believes he's finally understanding you correctly. Julian thought this was a story about jealousy and instability. He had no idea he was standing 3 feet from a man who'd been willing, 5 years ago, to let his own son believe that story forever, if it meant nobody looked too closely at Pharaoh dynamics. My father raised a hand for quiet, though the room had already gone still on its own. "The board has prepared a settlement," he said, "a full and final release of Sarah's remaining interest in the Voss-Miller Family Trust, in exchange for a signed acknowledgement closing this matter permanently, and an agreement not to pursue further contact with federal regulators regarding this company. It is, frankly, more generosity than the circumstances require." He looked at me directly now, and something in his face, not quite a smile, but close to one, told me he'd been waiting years to say the next part in front of an audience. "Sarah, please come up and sign." I need to tell you about the night before this, because the decision that put me in that chair, ready, wasn't made in the ballroom. It was made 12 hours earlier in a parking garage stairwell 3 blocks from the hotel, on a call with Agent Cho that I could have ended by saying one word. "The order's signed," she told me. "Judge Alvarez. Emergency asset freeze, transfer agent notification, the whole package. Marshals are read in. We can execute this Thursday morning quietly. Subpoena Richard at his office. No press, no shareholders, no risk to you personally." Or, she let the word hang there, the way she always did when she wanted me to argue with her instead of just agreeing. "Or I do it there," I said. "You don't have to be in that room, Sarah. Nobody would think less of you for taking the clean version." "He built that room to bury me in it," I said, "in front of the same people he spent 5 years lying to. I'm not interested in a version of justice that happens somewhere quiet, where none of them ever have to sit with what they said about me out loud." There was a long pause. I could hear traffic on her end, a horn somewhere far off. "That's not procedure talking," she said. "That's you wanting something."
Is that against the rules?
"No," she said. "It's just the part of this job nobody warns you about. Wanting something doesn't make the case weaker. It just means you have to be more honest with yourself about why you're doing it." "There's a risk profile to the quiet version, too," I said. "You subpoena him Thursday, and Foss has 3 days to shred what he can and call it routine document retention. Aurelian's beneficial owners scatter the second word gets out a subpoena's coming. Public and immediate closes those doors before anyone inside that building has time to think.
That's the operational argument, Cho said. I already logged it. It's solid. It'll hold up in the after-action review. I'm asking about the other one. I stood in that stairwell a long moment before I answered her honestly. He gets to walk into that ballroom tomorrow and call me an ex-soldier who couldn't hack it in front of 500 people, and every one of them will believe him, because that's the story he spent 5 years building. I want him to say it one more time. I want it to be the last time it's ever true in anyone's mind. Okay, she said, and I could hear something in her voice settle. Not approval exactly, more like respect for a decision that hadn't tried to hide what it was. Then we do it your way. But Sarah, once you're standing at that microphone, there's no version where you get to stop halfway through because it's harder than you expected. You understand that? I've understood that for 5 years, I said. I thought about that longer than I told her. I thought about my mother's compass, about the sentence she'd given me the week I left for basic. The direction only matters if you're honest about where you're actually standing. I wasn't doing this only for justice in the abstract. I was doing it because I wanted my father, specifically, in that room, specifically, to understand in real time that the daughter he'd discarded had spent 5 years becoming the exact kind of person capable of ending him. That's not a noble reason. It's a true one. I decided I could live with both things being real at once. Do it live, I told her. I'll be in the back row by the service exit. That was the decision that couldn't be undone. Everything after it was just execution. Back in the ballroom, my father was still waiting, hand extended slightly toward the podium, inviting me forward the way a man invites a dog he's certain will heal. I stood. I walked the center aisle slowly, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted every camera in that room to get a clean, unhurried shot of a woman who did not look defeated. My father's expression flickered, just slightly, at the pace. He'd expected me to hurry. Hurrying is what people do when they're desperate to make something end. 2 men in hotel security blazers stepped in near the front row, and I understood, the way you understand weather changing before the sky does, that they weren't hotel security. They were off-duty officers my father had arranged, in case I said something he didn't like at the microphone, in case this needed to become, quickly, a story about a woman being escorted out for disturbing the peace, instead of a woman speaking. Sign it, Sarah, Julian said quietly, not into his microphone this time, just to me, as I passed his chair. There was no cruelty in it. There was something worse. Pity. Please, just let this be over. I looked at him for 1 second. It's about to be, I said. Somewhere in the second row, someone began a slow, uncertain applause, and it caught, the way relief spreads faster than sympathy ever does, until half the ballroom was clapping for the tidy, familiar ending they thought they were about to witness. The prodigal daughter finally signing away her claim and disappearing quietly, the story closing exactly the way my father had spent 5 years telling it. I reached the podium. My father held the papers out to me himself, a black pen resting on top. And for one moment, one full, complete moment, I watched him believe he had already won. His shoulders had dropped half an inch. His jaw had unclenched. Around the room, board members were already exchanging small, satisfied nods, the body language of people watching an unpleasant chore finally conclude. I didn't take the pen. I stepped past my father to the main microphone and reached into my blazer instead. My name is Captain Sarah Miller, United States Army, retired under an order that will be formally corrected within the week, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steady the way it used to right before a briefing. For the last 5 years, I have also served as Senior Special Auditor attached to the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, assigned to investigate the diversion and unauthorized sale of protected defense technology developed under federal contract by this company. I held up the credential. It caught the stage lighting, and for one instant, the entire room seemed to inhale at the same time. Not a gasp exactly, something quieter and more total. 500 people recalibrating everything they'd believed for the last 40 minutes in the space of a single breath.
My father's face didn't fall the way you'd expect from television. It went very still, the stillness of a man running numbers in his head that he already suspects aren't going to add up in his favor.
"This is absurd," he said into his own microphone, too loud, the first crack in his composure all morning. "Security." "The men you hired are welcome to stay," I said. "They're about to have real work to do." I opened my laptop on the podium shelf, already logged into the secure terminal, already authenticated. Behind me, at the edge of the room near the service doors, I saw a woman in a gray suit step forward from where she'd been standing all morning, unnoticed, sipping coffee like any other attendee. Agent Cho met my eyes once and nodded.
Judge Alvarez of the Southern District of Texas signed an emergency order last night freezing all corporate and controlled personal accounts associated with Miller Energy and Defense, pending federal review of financial irregularities connected to a subcontractor entity known as Ferrodynamics, I said. That freeze is now being executed. I entered the authorization code. On the two screens behind me, the same screens that had shown my discharge photo 20 minutes earlier, a status field changed from pending to executed, timestamped, visible to the entire room. Additionally, I said, the Department of Defense is suspending Miller Energy and Defense's active federal contracts and reviewing its export authorization for microgrid infrastructure technology, effective immediately, pending investigation into the unauthorized transfer of gridlock program technology to a foreign-controlled entity. You have no proof, my father said, but the words came out thinner than he meant them to. I have 5 years of it, I said, but you're not going to have to take my word for any of it. I pressed play. The recording that filled that ballroom wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was ordinary. My father's own voice, captured 11 months earlier under a federal wiretap authorization tied to the Ferrodynamics investigation, in a conference room he'd believed was private, talking to Gerald Voss, the company's general counsel, in the flat, businesslike tone of a man discussing quarterly targets. If the audit gets close to Ferro, we let it land on Julian's desk. He signed the renewal on those invoices last spring. He didn't read them closely. He never does. He trusts me. We say he handled the vendor relationship without proper oversight. Negligence, not fraud. He does a suspension, maybe a fine. The company survives, and I stay clean. He's my son. He'll understand, eventually, why it had to be him and not me. I watched something happen to Julian's face that I will remember for the rest of my life. Not shock exactly, recognition, sick and immediate. The look of a person realizing a betrayal had already been fully designed for him, in advance, by someone he'd spent his whole life trying to make proud. The recording continued, my father's voice again, a few seconds later, almost bored. And Sarah was never the real problem. Sarah was the excuse. Once CID had someone to close the file on, nobody ever looked past her. I let it play 4 more seconds, the sound of Foss clearing his throat, uncomfortable, and my father moving on to the next agenda item, like he'd just approved a budget line. And then I stopped it. Nobody in that ballroom made a sound for what felt like a very long time. A reporter in the 3rd row had her phone raised, recording, her other hand pressed flat against her mouth. An elderly shareholder near the aisle was crying, quietly, for reasons I don't think even he could have explained. Maybe just the grief that comes from watching 31 years of trusting a man's word collapse inside 4 minutes. 2 board members near the front had already pulled out their own phones, not to work a word but to call someone, their lawyers most likely, already calculating their own exposure to a board that had approved compensation packages tied to numbers I'd just proven were fraudulent. Gerald Voss hadn't moved from his seat. He sat with his portfolio still closed in his lap, staring at the screen where the word executed still glowed, the stillness of a man who had known this morning was coming in some form for months and had simply run out of ways to postpone it. I looked for my father's oldest board ally, a silver-haired man named Whitlock, who had stood and applauded loudest 20 minutes earlier when the forfeiture papers were first produced. He wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking at his own hands. My father looked at the recording device on the podium, then at me, and I watched him try for one final time to find the version of this moment where he still controlled it. "Sarah," he said, and his voice had changed completely.
no longer performing for the room, just a father talking to a daughter. You have to understand why. I understand exactly why, I said. You needed a scapegoat who couldn't defend herself in public, and I was convenient, because I was already gone 8 months out of every year on deployment, and because you knew the Army would move quietly rather than embarrass a defense contractor. You didn't choose me because you thought I was guilty. You chose me because you thought I was the easiest to spend. The main doors at the back of the ballroom opened. 4 federal marshals came through them, unhurried, the way people move when there's no possibility of the situation escaping them. I recognized the lead marshal. I'd met him twice during case prep. A broad, quiet man named Delgado, who nodded once at me before he reached the stage. "Richard Miller," he said, "you're under arrest on federal charges, including wire fraud, unlawful export of controlled defense technology, and securities fraud, in connection with the improper voting of trust-held shares. You have the right to remain silent." My father did not resist. He didn't have the theater left in him for it. As they walked him past the front row, past Julian, past the board members who'd nodded so contentedly 10 minutes earlier, he said one thing to me, quiet enough that only I heard it. "You were supposed to be the loyal one." "I was," I said. "To the truth. You just never bothered finding out which one that was." They took Julian too, though, differently, not in handcuffs, escorted quietly toward a side room by a second marshal, for questioning, his face still pale with the disorientation of a man who has just learned, in front of 500 witnesses, that his own father had already written the script for sacrificing him. I caught his eye as he passed. He didn't look angry at me anymore. He looked like a man trying to remember how to stand up straight. "Sarah," he said, "I said things to you. You believed a story someone spent 5 years building carefully enough that even I almost couldn't see past it in time," I said. "We'll talk. Not today." He nodded, and for the first time in 5 years, it looked like a nod he actually meant. I want to tell you the room erupted into something satisfying after that. Applause, vindication, the kind of ending you'd expect. It didn't. Shareholders filed out in a stunned, murmuring quiet, phones already up, calling brokers, calling lawyers, calling spouses to say you will not believe what just happened. A company's entire public identity had just come apart in under 5 minutes. And underneath the drama of it, I was aware, the way I always am, of the parts nobody claps for. The 11,000 employees who had nothing to do with any of this, whose retirement accounts were now frozen pending review, whose Monday morning was about to get a great deal harder through no fault of their own. I found Agent Cho by the service exit afterward. "You good?" she asked. "Ask me in a month," I said, which was as honest an answer as I had. Before I left the building, I asked one more thing of the federal team, off the record, a favor rather than a directive. Julian's wife, Priya, and their 4-year-old Maya had nothing to do with any of this. No signature, no knowledge, no benefit beyond a comfortable life. Neither of them had asked to be built on fraud. I asked that the personal home be excluded from the initial asset freeze pending review, and that their names stay out of the press materials. It was granted. It wasn't mercy for Julian. It was something narrower, and I think more honest. A refusal to let a 4-year-old lose her home for a decision her father made, believing a lie his own father had constructed. Priya called me that same night. Her voice careful, the voice of someone who didn't yet know whether she was allowed to be grateful to me or supposed to hate me. "Maya asked me why Daddy didn't come home for dinner," she said. And then, after a silence long enough that I almost filled it, "Thank you for the house. I don't know what else to say to you yet." I told her she didn't owe me anything to say. I meant it. Whatever justice I was owed in that ballroom, it had never included a toddler losing the only home she remembered. The weeks after were slower than the ballroom and less cinematic, and that's usually how the real part of any reckoning goes. My discharge was formally reversed within 9 days, the record corrected to reflect an honorable, undisclosed federal assignment, the paperwork more mundane than the moment deserved, a stamped form instead of a ceremony. The Bronze Star I'd been quietly recommended for 5 years ago, before everything happened, the citation that had sat unsigned in the drawer because nobody had wanted to finalize an award for a soldier under investigation, was finally approved. They offered me a small ceremony. I asked for the box mailed instead. Some things you don't need 500 strangers watching you receive.
The Voss-Meller family trust converted to my full control 11 weeks later, exactly as my mother had structured it 2 decades earlier, and my father had spent years quietly working around with an expired power of attorney nobody at the bank had thought to question, because nobody questions a man who signs his own checks with that much confidence. It turned out my mother had understood her husband better than any of us gave her credit for while she was alive. She hadn't left me money. She'd left me a door that only opened once I'd actually become the kind of officer capable of walking through it honestly. Miller Energy and Defense survived, technically, under new interim leadership and a federal monitor, though 11,000 employees spent a hard winter finding out what happens to a company's contracts while regulators sort out exactly how deep the damage runs. A woman named Denise Ruiz, who'd run the Nevada Regional Maintenance Crews for 19 years and had nothing whatsoever to do with Ferrodynamics or Aurelian Systems, wrote me a letter through the company's employee relations office, asking, not unkindly, whether I understood that her whole team had been furloughed for 11 weeks while the contract review played out. I did understand. I wrote her back, which I didn't have to do, and told her the truth, that I hadn't been able to find a version of exposing this that protected every innocent person downstream of it, and that I was sorry the ledger hadn't balanced as cleanly for her as it had for me. I think about that letter more than people expect me to. I didn't do any of this to save that company, but I also didn't do it planning to let it damage people who'd done nothing but show up and do their jobs honestly, and it's a strange, unglamorous weight to carry, knowing your justice cost strangers something real, even when it was never aimed at them. Julian was never charged. The recording did what recordings do best. It told the truth without needing me to argue for it. He testified eventually about the invoices he'd signed without reading closely enough, agreed to a civil settlement regarding negligent oversight, and lost his position at the company he'd spent his whole adult life being groomed to inherit. Not everyone in that ballroom got the same ending. We talk now, roughly once a month. It isn't what it used to be. I don't think it ever will be, and I've stopped needing it to be. What we have instead is smaller, and it's honest, which is more than I can say for the 12 years before it. My father is currently awaiting trial. I don't visit. Some people would call that unfinished. I call it a boundary, which is different from an ending. A boundary is something you build on purpose and maintain, not something that happens to you. Agent Cho and I still work together. The Aurelian Systems thread didn't end with my father. It never does. Not with a case built on shell companies, because a name that dead ends once usually dead ends on purpose, and purpose means someone built it that way for a reason that outlives the first arrest. There are 2 more names on our list now, unrelated to Miller Energy and Defense, in an industry I'm not permitted to talk about yet, and one of them dead ends the same deliberate way Aurelian did. I took the assignment. I'm not sure yet whether that's because the work still matters to me the way it did 5 years ago, or because I've simply forgotten how to be a person who isn't building a case towards something. I've decided that's a question I'm allowed to keep answering slowly. 6 months after the ballroom, I drove out to the small military cemetery outside San Antonio where my mother is buried, on a morning cold enough that my breath fogged in front of the headstone. I took the brass compass out of my blazer pocket and turned it over once in my palm, the way I had every day for 5 years, without letting myself think too hard about why. I found the direction, I told her, out loud, in an empty field of white stones. It took longer than I wanted it to, but I was honest about where I was standing the whole time, even when nobody else could see it. The wind moved through the flags along the cemetery road, and I stood there a while longer than I'd planned to, the way you do at the end of something that cost you more than the people watching will ever fully know. I thought about the version of my mother I'd only started to understand properly in the last year. Not the woman who softened our father's edges at dinner parties, but the officer who had apparently spent years quietly documenting things she suspected long before I was ever discharged, building a trust structure designed to survive a husband she loved but had stopped fully trusting. I'll never know exactly when that happened for her, or what it cost her to keep loving him anyway, while she built the door I eventually walked through. Some questions don't get answered just because you finally have the clearance to ask them. I didn't leave the compass on the headstone. I put it back in my blazer pocket, the way I had every day for 5 years, and I drove back toward the highway with the windows down, letting the cold in on purpose, the kind of clarity you only get from cold air, after you've been holding your breath in one form or another for a very long time. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something, because I think about it more than I expected to. What would you have done in that back row? Sign the papers to make the humiliation end quickly, or stay quiet long enough to let the whole truth come out on your own terms, even knowing it would cost you people you loved along the way? Tell me in the comments where you'd have drawn that line. And if this kind of story means something to you, justice that takes its time and costs something real to get there, stay close. There are more of these coming, and I'd rather tell them with you before without you.